From ancient enslavement to modern exploitation, a comprehensive history of female slavery and its enduring legacy. Ancient Egypt, slavery and concubinage. Female slavery in ancient Egypt was a harsh reality, deeply embedded in the socio-economic fabric of the time. Women could be enslaved through various means: war, debt, or birth into slavery. These enslaved women were often subjected to a life of servitude, working in households, temples, or royal palaces. Their roles ranged from domestic labor to more intimate roles, including becoming concubines. Concubinage in ancient Egypt. Concubines were women who lived with their masters and were often involved in sexual relationships. Though not considered formal wives, concubines held a significant status in some households and could bear children who were sometimes recognized and provided for. The status and treatment of concubines varied, but many lived under the constant threat of abuse and exploitation. Legal and social status. In Egyptian society, enslaved women had limited rights and were largely considered property. Their social and legal status was defined by their master's authority, and they had little recourse against mistreatment. Despite the hierarchies and regulations, the harshness of their existence was undeniable, often marked by a lack of personal freedom and autonomy. Roman Empire, labor and entertainment. The Roman Empire also had a well-documented system of slavery that included the exploitation of women. In Roman society, slavery was a common institution, and women were integral to its operation, serving various roles. Hard labor. Enslaved women in Rome could be found in agricultural fields, mines, and workshops, performing grueling physical labor. Their work was often harsh and relentless, reflecting the empire's reliance on enslaved labor for economic productivity. Entertainment and leisure. In addition to labor, enslaved women were also exploited for entertainment. They were forced to participate in gladiatorial games or serve as performers in public spectacles. The Roman elite used these women's bodies as instruments of pleasure and amusement, reflecting the dehumanizing aspects of the empire's social structure. Legal and social context. Roman law and society allowed for the ownership of enslaved individuals, and women were not exempt from this. Enslaved women had no personal rights and were subject to the whims of their masters. Their lives were often marked by brutality and exploitation, with little protection or support. The Middle East. The harem system. The practice of female slavery in the Middle East is closely associated with the harem system, particularly during the Ottoman Empire. Harems and enslavement. Harems were domestic spaces reserved for the women of a Muslim ruler's household. These women were often enslaved and could include concubines, wives, and servants. The harem system was a complex institution where enslaved women were sometimes used for pleasure and entertainment, though their roles could also include administrative and diplomatic duties. Life in the harem. Life in the harem could vary widely. Some women lived in relative comfort and influence, while others faced severe restrictions and exploitation. The social hierarchy within the harem was rigid, with enslaved women often occupying the lowest rungs. Their treatment depended largely on their status and their master's preferences. Cultural and legal implications. While the harem system was legally sanctioned, it also reflected broader patterns of gender inequality and the commodification of women's bodies. The practice of keeping enslaved women in harems underscored the deep-seated patriarchal values of the time. Asia. Hidden systems of slavery. In various Asian cultures, slavery took on different forms, often hidden from mainstream view. Exploitation and trafficking. In ancient and medieval Asia, systems of slavery included the exploitation of women through trafficking networks. These women were often coerced or forced into servitude, working in households, brothels, or on plantations. Cultural context. Slavery in Asia was influenced by local customs and social structures. In some societies, women could be sold or exchanged as part of dowries or family arrangements. Their exploitation was often masked by cultural norms and practices, making it less visible to the outside world. Resistance and reform. While historical records often fail to capture the full extent of this exploitation, there were instances of resistance and reform. Some Asian cultures eventually recognized the inhumanity of such practices and sought to address them, though progress was slow and uneven. Modern forms of slavery, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. Despite the formal abolition of slavery, modern forms of enslavement persist, particularly through human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Human trafficking. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by human trafficking, which involves the illegal transportation of individuals for purposes of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Traffickers exploit vulnerabilities and coerce victims into situations where they have no control or freedom. Sexual exploitation. Sexual exploitation remains a significant issue, with women and girls often trafficked into prostitution or forced into sexual servitude. This form of exploitation is driven by demand and perpetuated by systemic inequalities and criminal networks. Global efforts and challenges. Efforts to combat modern slavery include international treaties, legal reforms, and advocacy campaigns. However, challenges remain in addressing the root causes of trafficking and exploitation, such as poverty, gender inequality, and corruption. Conclusion: remembering and fighting against injustice. The history of female slavery reveals a persistent pattern of exploitation and abuse that has transcended time and geography. From ancient Egypt to modern human trafficking, the plight of enslaved women highlights the enduring struggles against systemic injustice and inequality. Reflecting on history. Understanding the history of female slavery helps us to acknowledge the suffering of those who endured such abuses. It also underscores the importance of remembering their struggles and continuing the fight against modern forms of enslavement. Ongoing advocacy. The fight against human trafficking and sexual exploitation requires global solidarity and continued efforts to address the underlying causes of these injustices. By advocating for stronger protections, supporting survivors, and educating others about these issues, we can work towards a world where such exploitation is eradicated and human dignity is upheld. Honoring the past. The stories of those who endured female slavery remind us of the need for vigilance and compassion in our ongoing efforts to ensure that such dark chapters of history are never repeated.